I love that. Clearly, the guys definitely wanted to talk about the Alabama culture experience that we saw from last season. And if we're talking Bama, we got to bring in Mike Rodak from Bama 24/7. Mike, obviously, they were talking about what they saw outside looking in and from last year. But from your perspective, on the ground there in Tuscaloosa, what changes have you seen from last offseason, Kalen DeBoer's first, to now what we're seeing this spring?
Yeah, I mean, last offseason was brand new to Kalen DeBoer. He was trying to balance as much of the Nick Saban way with his way that worked for him at Washington and worked for him at Fresno State. And with, players that had just kind of gone through the shock of the retirement from Nick Saban and we're trying to get used to a new system and a new way of doing things. And so the biggest change really from year one to year two is that players know what to expect. They've been here before, or they're new players who have specifically come here to play for Kalen DeBoer. So at baseline, that helps. But look, I do think there is some level of tightening the screws a little bit this offseason and trying to make sure that what happened last year doesn't happen again. We did hear Rock Montgomery, one of the backup offensive linemen, come out earlier this offseason and talk about, like Damian said, the jewelry and some of the things that maybe were allowed last year during the offseason program weren't being allowed during the offseason program this year. And that was downplayed a little bit behind the scenes, but at the end of the day, Rock was there every day, during the offseason program. He would know, just like Damian would know what things were like under Nick Saban because he was there every day. So I'm personally not going to discredit anything that was said there, but I think there was a little bit of downplaying of some of the changes and saying, look, whatever happened last year wasn't necessarily bad, wasn't necessarily lackadaisical or undisciplined, but we just want to get things a little bit tighter and a little bit better this year, I think is the main message.
Yeah, and this is not the first time that this has come up. I'm sure that you guys talked about this a lot last fall, that the sky is falling when they're not having near as much success as they had under Nick Saban. But as we've been saying all show, that's an incredibly tough job for Kalen DeBoer to have to come in and to implement his own way while also trying to do what has worked at Alabama for so many years. And I can tell that people are fired up right now in our YouTube chat because they always love this discussion. Is there a culture problem? What do you hear from players as far as the current Alabama culture?
Yeah, again, it's always kind of tiptoeing around the idea of were we doing something wrong before? And I think players don't want to say that. I think Kalen DeBoer doesn't want to imply that. I think they want to say that they were doing things right before, because then, like Damian said, like, well, why weren't you being on time to meetings? Why weren't you doing all these things the way you should be doing them? And then after the Tennessee game, you decide, it's time to get things back under control. So I think it's a very careful balance when players or coaches are talking about it because they don't want to make it seem like things weren't under control before. But again, it's just them saying we got to get back to the standard. We got to get back to winning. Tim Keenan, who's been around this team for 5 years now, he's from Birmingham. He knows this program really well, has talked about last year not being the standard at Alabama and just trying to do things a little bit better across the board. So it's a little bit tricky, in terms of the messaging from players. But again, I think that's kind of the gist of it. And, it's for Alabama, it's just the standard is so high and football has changed and you can't necessarily do what Nick Saban did for so long with players because players have changed. Players have more options. They can walk out the door if you're being too hard on them. And you're running them into the ground. So it's a different dynamic that this new coaching staff has to deal with that Nick Saban didn't have to deal with 10 years ago.
Which Nick Saban himself has acknowledged the changes in college football.
Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of players, we got Ty Simpson, Keelan Russell, and Austin Mack, three guys battling for the starting quarterback position. It sounds like they're all getting a fair shot at it, but is there an early leader? If so, who?
I wouldn't say there's an early leader other than I think Ty Simpson has started the spring in terms of being in the best position to win the job. And I don't think anything has changed to this point. Now, Alabama does have a scrimmage this Thursday, their first scrimmage of the spring. They have another scrimmage next Friday, and then they have their A-Day practice. And that's kind of the meat of real live reps this spring. And so we haven't gotten to that point yet. In about 2 more weeks, there could be a better sense of where the job and the competition stands. But I would not be surprised if this thing goes deep into, the fall, obviously fall, not the fall itself, but fall camp, August, and getting closer to the start of the season because they have some options. And Austin Mack has a history with Ryan Grubb and Kalen DeBoer from Washington. Ty Simpson has the most experience of being in college football, but then Keelan Russell has the talent. And I think the same thing about transfer portal. You can't just sit a five-star player on your bench for an entire year, 2 years, and just expect, oh, he's going to develop and we can play him at some point. Look, in college football these days, you got to play a guy pretty soon. Otherwise, in a lot of cases, they're gone. And I don't think this staff has shown a fear in playing guys early. Obviously, with Ryan Williams last year, he came in the summer. He wasn't even an early enrollee, and he was starting the first game because he was that good. So if Keelan Russell proves himself on the practice field the rest of this spring and in fall camp to be that good, I don't think the staff is going to hesitate in playing him. But again, the safest, the most veteran option they have is still Ty Simpson. And that's kind of your, I don't want to say fallback plan, but at least that's something you've seen him before, what he brings to this team. And that's where I think the favorite conversation probably still leads me.
Definitely a tough decision to have to make, but a good decision and a good problem to have, having to decide between two 5-star quarterbacks and a guy who was top 10 quarterback in his class and has a lot of experience with Kalen DeBoer. The reason that they're having to decide between who will be the starting quarterback next season is because their starter is off to the NFL and Jalen Milroe. And man, everybody's talking about that 40 time from Pro Day and how that could potentially skyrocket him up some of the draft charts. From your point of view, what do you think his NFL outlook is?
I don't think it's changed as much as the 40 time might imply. And that 40 time itself was a little bit aggressive when Alabama put that 4.37 out. That was faster than what the scouts in attendance were clocking based on the cameras that were there and the reporters that were there. My own stop clock had a little bit more 4.5 range. So 4.37 was a little bit off, I think. And then I think the official time that they put out later was a 4.40. So fast, but we knew Jalen Milroe was fast. I don't think anybody was necessarily standing there surprised that he ran a good 40 time. And from the get-go, and this is what a GM in the NFL told me back in September, it's going to matter what he does in some of these facility visits, these private workouts that they have when they bring him in to their NFL team facility, and how comfortable do they feel with him being a quarterback running an NFL offense? Because he did do a lot of option stuff at Alabama, obviously relied upon his legs a lot. That doesn't necessarily translate all the time to the NFL, and being able to make the right reads and make the right throws is very important. And I think that's ultimately where teams are going to either feel comfortable about him or have some hesitation. And yes, his pro day might have helped a little bit, but I think you're still talking about a player who's probably a second or third round pick. And it's a team that takes him knowing that there's going to be some level of risk that his style of play, which wasn't always successful at Alabama, might not translate to the NFL.
Yeah, if it took you until March to realize that Jalen Milroe was fast, I mean, what do you do? And we knew that about him. Another player that we know is spectacular, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard of him, Ryan Williams. He actually got to catch some passes from Milroe at Pro Day. He finally is 18 years old, but still at least 2 years away from the NFL. What are expectations for him for this upcoming season?
They're big. I mean, he's one of the top receivers in college football, and a lot of that goes back to that Georgia game last year and what we saw from those two big catches, especially that second touchdown catch, and really put him on the national scene. And he did have a couple big catches after that. There's one against Vandy that I can remember, but if you look at his stats, there was a pretty big drop-off for Ryan Williams last season. His final 8 games, he only averaged about 40 receiving yards per game. There were 233 players in FBS football that had more receiving yards than him over the final 8 games of last year. So I think a lot of people might point to Jalen Milroe and some of his shortcomings as a passer. They might point to the offensive coordinator last year, Nick Sheridan. Whatever the case may be, I don't know how much blame you want to put on Ryan Williams. There needs to be a big increase in his production in 2025. So whoever's the quarterback, we know who the offensive coordinator is, and Ryan Grubb, who had one of the most prolific offenses in college football a couple years ago at Washington. You need to be able to use Ryan Williams and his skills better, but Ryan Williams also needs to be more consistent as well. There are some issues with drops at times with him. Obviously, that the athletic ability is there with him. We know that. But if he's the phenom that we think he is, he's probably going to be in the NFL in 2 more years. So he's basically a third of the way through his college career. And I think there's a lot of potential that still needs to be reached with him over these potentially last 2 years of his college career.